日本建築情報学会で皆様ようこそ。本日のディスカッショントークをホストするガリ・ボイヤドと申します。今回お招きしたのは、リュック・ピーソンさんとサンドラ・ユカナさんによる建築設計事務所 You+Pea でございます。お二人様は仕事の傍ら、ロンドン・バルトレット建築学校の教育者として、ビデオゲーム、Urbanism のユニットを運営しています。彼らの研究はスペキュラティブデザインの最先端を行くものであり、彼らの話を聞くのが待ち遠しでございます。さて、ゲスト様にバトンタッチさせていただきます。Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 30th edition of the Japanese Society for Architectural Informatics. My name is Ghali Bouayad, and I am your host for tonight's talk. I have the pleasure to have Pearson and Sandra Youkhana. They are London-based architects and educators at the Bartlett School of Architecture. Luc and Sandra, welcome and thank you for accepting my invitation.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be here and part of this platform.
So maybe we can jump right away. I met you a few years ago in Tokyo, and I was pleased and impressed by how you link your academic research to real projects in practice. So could you give us within a few minutes a general preview of your work, process, and approach to architecture in general?
Yeah, let's just share the screen and then we can start to talk about that. So hopefully you can see this. Let us know if you can't. Is that what? Yeah, okay, great. So yeah. Oh, can you see?
Yeah, now I can. Go ahead.
Okay,
great.
Brilliant.
So yeah, we have a studio in London called You+Pea. And we work essentially, I would say, between architecture and video games. So this kind of comes out of a long-standing interest of ours as like the player of games as kids growing up, but also I suppose starting to sort of see technological developments that were happening in the field, and the fact that the video games have become, you know, their influence has sort of grown from being a hobby, you could say, when we were growing up, to being something that's really pervasive and kind of shaping the way that we see the world.
Yeah, and I think what we really like about using the medium, the video game as a technology, is it's kind of very inclusive nature, and being able to collaborate with others and really place our work in quite public facing environments. So museums, cultural institutions, universities, and yeah, and this is a kind of snapshot of some of the exhibitions we've designed with our students. We run the video game urbanism research cluster at the Bartlett School of Architecture as part of the urban design master's program, and this is really where we test out a lot of these ideas that we'll be discussing today. And you can see all the students make video games and they produce drawings and accompanying material about their projects as well.
So I think one of the things that maybe distinguishes this work from just pure game design is the fact that we take on kind of topics from urbanism, from architecture and architectural history, and then we use games as a way of kind of uncovering some of those logics. So to understand maybe how cities work and function. So for example, this was a multiplayer game made a couple of years ago, which was we visited Las Vegas, and we were really kind of interested in the continuing role of symbolism in architecture, but also the fact that virtual worlds rely heavily on symbolism, because the sort of affordances of objects and things like that are kind of synthetically placed onto objects in game worlds.
Yeah, and these projects were also launched at a time where we were just going into lockdown, so the students then kind of adapted their processes to create networked environments, networked multiplayer games where all of them could be, you know, in the same space and sharing that space and affecting it as a collaborative game world.
Yeah, so we have, for instance, projects questioning the role of museums and the collection of objects and gathering within museums, and looking at the ideas of folksonomies. So the notion that there's kind of databases of information that are organized by groups of people, and how that has a kind of power. And then we've had games that are looking at like the infrastructure that's behind our cities that we don't see, or even a two-player game that was about the relationship between government and citizens in kind of overcoming or a pandemic-based city. So this is actually, that was kind of interesting because they were building the game at the same time as public policy was being enacted in the UK around COVID and things like that. So we also use a lot of kind of contextual studies. So again, this was some students taking the kind of logic of electronic gambling machines and applying them to Las Vegas, or making kind of procedural world generating things that take the various sort of symbolic icons within different Las Vegas casinos and use it to generate a new architecture.
Yeah, revealing kind of different histories of cities. So this is actually a game about Tokyo and how it grew, its urban form and morphology, and allowing a player to kind of discover that through the mechanics and interface of the game. So this kind of layered vertical history of that's playable to tell them about these kind of urban phenomena.
Yeah, again, the games kind of obviously offer a platform where the meaning and logic of every object has to be embedded, which means that students have to think quite carefully about what they're actually designing in the world and what kind of what agency objects have within that world. Yeah. And so for us, it's a really interesting way of starting to also critique existing projects. So this student was looking at Walt Disney's design for Epcot and kind of using sort of Mario Galaxy style planetary gravity. And then we had students that are interested in looking at the kind of collapse between 2- and 3-dimensional space in video game worlds and how they can start to manipulate that.
Yeah, and I suppose as architects or urbanists, looking at the way in which cities are communicated by their media, whether that's questioning maps or drawings like plans and elevations, and through the game engine, looking at and questioning representation of cities as well through the games.
Right. So when I read your published work and articles, the first question that comes to me is, how does a video game provide you with feedback from the virtual habitable space to inform the real one? Like, is it possible to extrapolate the avatar's fictional behavior?
Yeah, I think, for instance, a game like this, which was looking at the planning tools in London. So what regulates what can be built in London. So the students basically took some of the rules and the laws from the UK and actually kind of transcribed them into the game so that players have the ability to, I suppose, test the limits of those rules. But then once the player builds a structure in the game, that's obviously also something that you can kind of export as a 3D model. You can export it to other pieces of software, and you can visualize it in the same way that you would, visualize any other kind of architectural design. I also think that there's, like, the game we're looking at here is actually a kind of 2-player game. So also games allow us to create kind of design environments with multiple people within them operating at the same time, which I think is also a kind of powerful tool for generating understanding.
Yeah, I think a design tool or a kind of conversation that might be quite hard to discuss in traditional media, I think by putting that in a game, it automatically kind of makes things a little bit more easy to understand than maybe a traditional plan or a section or a load of text that's hidden on a website somewhere. So yeah, we really see that this is an opportunity to have those conversations more visually and in a more interactive way that could then inform real processes in the design and procurement of cities as well.
Yeah,
sorry. And how do you actually trigger like this speculative narratives for architectural design? Like, do you happen? I think in one of your articles you are speaking about metaphorical tropes and how you actually translate from the real to unreal words. Could you give us a word about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're really keen to integrate is looking at history and looking at context. So all of the work that happens in our studio is based around looking at a particular city as a site, and also looking at the history of architecture as well. For us, it's really important that the conversations around technology also reflect, the history of what technology was and what technology did, and kind of then can sort of tap into some of the questions that have been asked a lot in architecture in the past as well. So we would ask students to look at the work of previous architects, to look at the cities that they're operating in very deeply, and to kind of start to unpick this and use this to drive the mechanics of their games. So I suppose these types of images here are something that we produce with our students, where the students are really breaking apart their work as a system, as a systematic understanding of an urban form or an urban condition that then their game design is kind of participating within.
Yeah, we find the kind of world building aspect of game environments really interesting, because although they might take they might take a real city or a real context as a starting point, the way by which that's extracted and translated into a game environment to really emphasize a particular, as Luke said, history or future or system about that city, to really kind of amplify it as an argument, is really interesting to us, and something we spend hours discussing with our students.
So yeah, I mean, maybe one of the other things to talk about a little bit more is again, this, when we look at a video game like Grand Theft Auto 5, you know, it's 8 years old now, but there's this kind of amazing resemblance to the real world Los Angeles. But when you actually dig down deeper into the game, you find that the designers are very clever, because they realize that if they tried to make a one-to-one geographic, you know, replica of Los Angeles, it wouldn't necessarily be that fun or interesting. Instead, they're playing with our kind of sensibility of the place. And so I guess this is something that we also do a lot in our work as well. So a project that we're working on at the moment is kind of come out next year, is a kind of big book on commercial video game worlds and how their architecture functions.
Yeah, a video game atlas, kind of encompassing and analysing 12 commercial video games, and you might recognise some of the images here. So this is from Zelda, and really kind of looking at them as real places, as kind of very potent and credible urban environments that have their own set of logics and ways of kind of manipulating space. And by drawing all these out visually and analysing them, yeah, we hope to really kind of learn lessons or start to understand the differences between physical space and space which is manipulated by computational processes.
Yeah, I suppose for us as well, there's this situation where, you know, the technology in relation to architecture, I think there's, especially in London, but I think around the world now, there's definitely a kind of resurgence of people looking at technology in relation to narrative and stories. And so the idea that I suppose the technological discourse in architecture is mature enough, but also we can see maybe that what we also want to get from our designs is a sense of being able to imagine the world in different ways. And so for us, again, video games are really key thing to be looking at in this, because we're always looking at some kind of narrative, whether it's overtly a story or whether it's a spatial narrative that's being told through the game world. But at the same time, that game world is, you know, entirely made from code. It's entirely synthetic, and it's right. Yeah.
So you were speaking about Grand Theft Auto video game, and you were saying that in your article that the game designer didn't translate literally Los Angeles urban design into the game. So since these games are, the environments are made by the same protagonists and almost the same softwares, how do you actually escape the sometimes as architects we hit that imagination wall? So how do you escape from unimaginative settings? Like how do you rely on computational tools to actually create fictional architectures and suggest narratives using these tools? And sorry, one more question is also how this discussion goes with your students.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, because sometimes the students come to us and say, why are we studying video games?
or what's the urban design? You know, what's the architecture that I'm creating?
Yeah, is there such a clear sense between like a problem to be solved and a solution to that? And I think the answer is that perhaps there's not, but it's also, I think it kind of touches into the idea of like designing platforms as well. You know, we can see video games, they're not only narrative spaces, they're not only like 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional constructions, but they're platforms for players to kind of bring their own memories into, or to become communities. And so I think in a way, what we kind of also want to understand from video games is that they have a slightly different culture of like spatial storytelling and narrative to architecture, but that by kind of combining those two, and maybe what we're doing in this book as well is to like contrast one another, we can start to pick out some really interesting things that can feed back into both elements. So I guess architecture has a history of spatial storytelling, of course, a very long one, and at the same time games do it, but games sometimes do it in quite a kind of different way, where it might be about like emphasizing the material of an everyday object or something, which in a sense does have the same connection to like valuable materials being, gold or expensive materials, but in the virtual world it's kind of encoded, so the symbolism means something slightly different. So
yeah, no, we're really interested by the kind of also the facade that's given in a video game, but if you kind of were to turn the corner or clip out of the world, it's maybe a kind of paper thin digital object, and what that can tell us about what kind of parallels or differences there might be between space for a game and space for reality.
Right. Again, in one of your articles, because you were speaking about the meaning of objects, you were citing Louis Kahn example of the brick. And so how can we actually invent and give new meaning to architectural elements? And you were citing this video game that was based on a brick, and its meaning completely shifted through it. So
yeah, I think in that case, in the game The Last of Us, you end up using a brick. It's still presented in the world as being a brick, but you use the brick to like distract enemies and things like that. So if you actually break it down to the mechanics of the game, the brick is sort of used not as a building element, but is used as an element that's designed to draw people in a certain direction.
And I think that's what's exciting about game objects and game spaces, to be able to give them new meaning and new functions very quickly, to then kind of reinterpret how we might experience them or interact with them or engage with them. And that's what a lot of the topics of our games deal with as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if you think of the equivalent to the brick is the kind of block in Minecraft. And so this is a game that we made for a museum in Germany last year. Was it this year? Earlier this year, which was is looking at kind of residential skyscraper developments in London. So there's vast parts of London which are being kind of completely uprooted, and they're building lots of these kind of incredibly expensive residential towers. And so we were kind of interested by how that's kind of I suppose attached to the production of architectural imagery, so like renderings, advertisements and things like that. So this is a game that's called the London Developers Toolkit, and essentially the game kind of generates a series of random towers for you, and then you as the player can make your own like advert for this. It's connected up to Twitter, so it would automatically tweet what you've created, and then it was also connected up to a printer in the gallery, so it would print your drawing, and then the game would crash and it would kind of start itself again. But I think, again, for us, it's interesting because Minecraft has now become such an emblematic form of like kind of creativity, and obviously the blocks have all of these kind of different meanings in the game, but it's also a sort of reassuring kind of, sort of childlike aesthetic that's quite nostalgic. So for us, there was something quite interesting about making a game that was a kind of critique of, I guess, certain
like gentrification in London and how and its effect, which isn't necessarily positive on the communities that live in cities, but through the kind of playful aesthetic of the game, you can begin to secrete maybe more serious or deeper narratives to begin to I suppose make them forefront them a little bit more than they might be if they weren't presented in this way.
Yeah, the cuteness of the game is like a way of playing a bit with people's expectations as well, which I think is quite interesting, because we do have certain expectations about what games can do. Therefore, if you subvert those, there's an interesting space there. yeah, I think again to sort of see it together, like the player could use could do sort of napkin sketches, you know, like an architect's imagination just pouring out of them onto the page, but actually it's like a gesture recognition bit of software in there, so you can be more or less accurate against a perfect sketch. So again, for us, there's something quite playful about the idea that you can quantify the amount of inspiration in a sketch, and it may or may not come up to the right standard, and then if it doesn't, then you can't proceed in the game, and if it does, then you clearly are a wonderful architect and you can.
And I suppose attaching quite playful mechanisms to begin to engage with some of these narratives is also something that's really very available to us in a game environment.
So this was a project that we did recently, which is based on a concept called Everyone is Architecture. And so this was inspired by Hans Hellein's declaration that everything is architecture some time ago, but, you know, talking about the expanding field of architectural practice and what it kind of draws into it. And so we were kind of interested in developing a sort of AR environment for building architecture.
Yeah, I suppose what was interesting to us about this is that everybody would embody a building component. So, you know, you would become a column, or you'd become a roof, or you'd become a brick, and when you'd hold a kind of a phone up, or you'd be in the AR environment, everybody would be embodying these different building components. So a way of kind of generating and promoting collaborative design through a kind of very playful mechanism is something that we were proposing here.
Right, this question of embodying an object, I think it's somehow very inclusive way of designing and making decisions. My question would be, for instance, with your students, how do you actually communicate them the sense of proportions, like of the space? Like, how do you deal with these questions?
Yeah, I suppose it's a difficult one, because in a way in the virtual environment it's completely scaleless. You know, it can be incredibly vast, or it can be incredibly, I suppose you define those kind of scales within the environment. So again, I think a lot of it comes from the experience of the player and the journey that you want to take the inhabitant on. You know, nobody wants to kind of trudge for 10 minutes in an empty space. And I think we really love that intensity about game environments, to be able to kind of communicate multiple spatial narratives or interactions in a very kind of densely packed space, which you might not experience in a real city. So again, that kind of intensity of a virtual environment that you're designing is really important, and perhaps quite different to the way you'd approach it in a real city, which has, you know, real spatial constraints and things like that. So we really love this method of compressing space to promote and to experience more intense experiences as well.
Yeah, I guess at the same time is like, there's the first time you drag like the standard avatar into a game engine, that avatar has like a scale, and the scale is probably actually, you know, obviously average heights are different around the world, but that scale is usually quite large, because we're kind of used to the first person shooter game where it's probably, you know, some kind of big soldier type person who's the protagonist. So even to sort of say to the students, you know, what this makes you question what proportion is and like who we're designing for. So if you put your standard controller into the world, you're starting to dimension stuff in a certain way. And I think it's quite interesting, because as Sandra's sort of talking about, the games often play with the kind of the dimension of space as well, because they want to make us, you know, they want, weirdly, you play with the scale in order to make something feel more naturalistic. Again, that's something that architecture's done for, you know, hundreds of years as well. But I think in a sense it's also this case of, we might say to the students that, you know, you're working in a site, so go find some information about that site. And if they bring back the OpenStreetMap source that they've put into the game engine, then it may not look entirely correct, because again, but like the GTA designers will find that once you actually place something into the virtual world without all of the grain that you get in real life, it feels to be empty and a little bit uncanny. And so I think it's a kind of back and forth. I'd say the other thing that we do that we've that we've done a lot, in a lot more detail in our book, but is also to ask the students to play games as kind of critically as well. So to think like, what's the agency of the person that I am in the game? What can I understand about the world? What can I understand about the social structures and how landscapes experienced and things like that? So in a way, that's a way for us to like answer the question they might have, which is why should we look at video games? Is because if you do look at a video game, you'll find all of these different things that have been encoded into the world that are not necessarily different to what we face in reality, but someone's made the decision about what is and isn't important, and that's kind of political, and that's a design decision, and there's a lot of layers for them to uncover there.
Brilliant. I realized it was a very difficult question. So we're going toward the end. Perhaps one or two more questions. When I met you, it was 2 years ago when Ryuji Fujimura sensei invited you to Tokyo University of the Arts. Mm-hmm. So I think within your practice and academia, you make several trips to Tokyo for workshops and study sessions. So how does the Japanese cityscapes and urban setups enrich and inform your research? Like, what is different from a Western point of view?
I mean, I think there's quite a lot of things that appeal to us. I mean, obviously, some of these come from the idealized viewpoint of the outsider that may or may not be correct. Yeah. I think one thing is the scale and the kind of three-dimensional complexity of the city. There's streets that are really narrow that we don't necessarily encounter in London in the same way. And so that kind of the sort of low rise but high density scale is somehow really appealing, because it means that every street seems to have something incredibly interesting happening along it, even if it's just the houses, the way that they kind of meet one another. And for us, it's like it feels like aesthetically very rich just to walk around the city.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, yeah, the kind of, as a city that's been depicted so many different times through different types of media, whether that's games or film or books that we read, I think that also has a massive, cultural draw to us, and we can really appreciate that, but also discover different histories and narratives in the city that we maybe hadn't ever discovered before. So yeah, I think that's something that definitely keeps driving us back.
Yeah, again, it may, the architects working in Tokyo may or may not agree, but to us it feels like Tokyo is like a really amazing architectural laboratory as well, because there's these like amazing challenging sites with the type of house that would be really difficult to build in somewhere like London in the sort of equivalent neighborhoods. And so there's kind of real sort of entertainment in seeing the flexibility that architects, to us at least, appear to have to kind of express really interesting ideas, especially about ways of living and kind of domestic space. And I guess we're also just generally, massive fans of the culture and the various different aspects of that. So I mean, for us, it's also we've done projects where we've been really fascinated by things like the medal games that you find in arcades, and to us it's really fascinating to have these machines that you can't really gamble and win any real money on, but they're just this aesthetic overload that's incredibly playful and very spatial, and we found that really fascinating as well.
Right. Absolutely, I'm here since 6 years, and that fascination never fades. Absolutely. Any date for a future workshop?
Oh yeah. Well, we're hoping to come back soon. Yeah, fingers crossed.
Cool. And before I ask you to introduce the next guest, because we have perhaps another 2 minutes, I think we spoke this week, and you told me about a book that you were designing and submitting. Could you give us a word and perhaps encourage our audience to look into it in the future?
Yeah, so the title, the working title is the Video Game Atlas, and so it's being published with Thames and Hudson. It's coming out next year, and essentially it's a kind of a deep analysis of 12 commercial video games. So we go from some really well-known games like Zelda Breath of the Wild, or some more kind of artsy, semi-artsy games like Death Stranding by Kojima, through to things like Dwarf Fortress, which is this really strange game that's all completely kind of text character based, but is incredibly complex. So we kind of go through all of these worlds, and we've done about 200 drawings, examining them and kind of writing about their architecture and making connections to history.
And I suppose just to emphasize the variety of the visual material, and that each game is different. We're looking at them differently and we're analyzing them differently because they're all kind of very uniquely interesting in their own right. So we're excited to share that with everyone soon.
Sounds amazing. Can't wait for it.
Maybe I'll stop sharing.
Could you tell us about your guests for the next session?
So we're really excited to welcome on the 16th Deborah Lopez and Hayden Charbel, who are architects and colleagues of ours at the Bartlett as well. And they run their own studio, and they have kind of similar working methods to us. They also use game engines, but in a very kind of different way, and they deal a lot with kind of climate and extreme environments, and so that'll be really interesting to see them, to talk to them about the differences and some of the stuff that they're working on.
We thought they'd be good people to continue this kind of conversation around narrative technology, as Sandra said, dealing with the climate and how we can use technology in a way of like exposing things that people wouldn't necessarily know about or comprehend without that use of technology. So we look forward to introducing them to you.
Brilliant. Looking forward to. Amazing. Well, I'm not sure if I think this is time. So thank you very much for your time, for joining us, introducing your work. Looking forward for your next adventure, and also thank you for the Japanese audience, and also for people based abroad. Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening or an afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.